Welcome to the Wayne Public Library's virtual author chat. My guest today is Mary Beth O'Connor. Mary Beth has been sober since 1994. She also is in recovery from abuse, trauma, PTSD, and anxiety. Her story is chronicled in her memoir, From Junkie to Judge: One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. She's had essays in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and Recovery Today. Mary Beth is a director for She Recovers Foundation and Life Ring Secular Recovery. She regularly speaks on behalf of these organizations and about multiple and secular paths to recovery. She develops relationships with other organizations such as Women for Sobriety, and Mary Beth trains attorneys and medical professionals about substance use disorder and recovery. 6 years into her recovery, Mary Beth attended Berkeley Law. She worked at a large law firm, then litigated class actions for the federal government. In 2014, she was appointed a federal administrative law judge, from which position she retired early in 2020. Welcome, Mary Beth. Please tell us a little more about yourself and your memoir, From Junkie to Judge: One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction.
Well, let me just first say that you are in my home state of New Jersey, and so I'm always happy to talk to them. And anyone who's listening to this, about the first of the book is set in New Jersey because it goes until I went to college. So yeah, I grew up in Bordentown, which is right next to Trenton. You know, it's a smaller town in central New Jersey. My book, I really trying to sort of capture the arc of child abuse, that led to early drug use and early excessive drug use. That is unfortunately a common pathway. And then I also wanted to show recovery, like a realistic example of what recovery looks like. And so 1/3 of the book is about my first 3 years, building a plan that worked for me, dealing with my PTSD that I didn't know I had, and anxiety. And so that's sort of the overall arc of the book: childhood into the drug use, and then into the first 3 years of recovery.
What inspired you to write the memoir, and how did you choose the specific stories that you included in it?
Yeah, so when I was appointed a federal judge, and I had 20 years sober at that time, it was kind of a natural reflection point. Like, I was shooting meth at 17, and I didn't get sober until 32. So it was a really long haul. And when I was appointed a judge, I was sort of like, well, how the heck did I go from shooting meth at 17 until 32 and then becoming a judge? So it was really a time of thinking about, is my story unusual enough that I could actually make it of use? And so I started thinking about whether a memoir might be the right format, and I hadn't read much memoir, so my first step was actually reading some. I thought that was a good idea. And so I read a few memoirs, right in a row, and especially recovery memoirs. But that was the original impetus, was to really sort of reflect on my own story and to think about whether my story could be helpful to others.
And choosing the specific stories of your life to include?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a challenge. Well, I will say that one of the things, as far as the structure goes, the reason I ended up with the structure I did is because when I was reading those other memoirs, what I noticed was that a lot of them don't show where the addiction came from. And by the way, if I say substance use disorder, that is the modern term for addiction. I don't want to confuse anyone. That's my habit to say that. But what I noticed in a lot of recovery memoirs was they sort of leap into the chaos of the addiction, and they don't show the source of it. They don't show why. They don't show where it came from. And then I noticed at the end of a lot of memoirs, it's sort of like I went to a couple meetings and everything was great. So, well, that's not how recovery works. And so I thought, the arc I would like is a more comprehensive story. And so that was the first decision point. I want to go from my childhood until the end of my 3rd year of recovery, when my sobriety was really solid and my trauma and mental health recovery was, well on its way. And then you're right, it is about what to include and not to include. And that's a challenge. And so the way I started was I started taking notes about events and thoughts and ideas and turning points. And I made like an outline. And then my first draft, I included a lot more than ended up in the book. And so my first edit pass, I cut 25% of the book out. And the reason was because I had like more than one story for the same point, more than one story that was illustrative of the nature of my relationship with my mother, or, the type of abuse at home. So it was really to try to avoid unnecessary sort of repetition as far as not the specific event, but sort of the import of the event, not to make sure that I wasn't boring the reader by, stretching this out too long. So, but it is always a challenge what to include and what not to include. But for first draft, I just said, I'm just going to write it. And then when I see it as a whole, then I'll make the decision as to what stays and what goes.
Okay. You touch on some difficult topics in your book. How did you balance personal reflection with storytelling?
Yeah. I mean, when I first read the memoir and I realized it was written like a novel, but it's like a novel plus, right? Because you do need to have that reflection about, what it meant to me at the time, what I think about it now, sort of the standing back from a little bit of distance and putting it in context and explaining why it was important, or what it meant to me. And so there is definitely that balance that you need in memoir. And so for me, I actually did a reflection pass. So when I was writing it, I tried to make sure there was a balance between, the actual immersive in-scene event and summary, right? But also about reflection. But I did a pass specifically to look at and see whether I had enough reflective thoughts and information for the reader to really sort of grasp the messages that I was trying to relay, and to make sure that my themes came through. I mean, a lot of that is in the reflection as well. So I did a number of specific passes. Like one of them was for emotion. I did a pass to make sure that there was enough emotional description that the reader would connect and understand what happened. And so I did several sort of very specific passes, and the takeaway reflection was one of them.
Okay. And while you were writing the memoir, were there any challenges you faced writing about your own life, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I will say the first challenge, which isn't my own life, I'll admit that, but the first challenge was that when I read those memoirs, I realized I don't know how to write like that. Okay, so I was a really excellent legal writer, but a memoir is written like a novel. It's a very different skill set. And so the first thing I had to do was admit to myself, you don't know how to do this, right? And so I did take memoir writing classes, and then just some novel classes, how to write a good scene, how to write good dialogue, things like that. I mean, so that was sort of the first writing challenge, was going out and getting the skills that I needed to write the best memoir that I was capable of writing. But on the personal side, the difference between a memoir and a novel is that you are dealing with painful events in your life, and that can be challenging. Now, by the time I wrote the memoir, it had been a while since I had done any therapy. So when I got sober, I had, childhood abuse, sexual assaults, domestic violence. So I had a lot of trauma underneath my drug use. I mean, I always knew that was what was pushing me into it. But I also needed to deal with that in order to stay sober, but also just to be happy, right? So I did a lot. I did about 9 years of therapy with a trauma expert, individual, and then group therapy. And so I had done a lot of, work on healing and, thinking and talking about the challenging events. But by the time I was writing the book, there was a gap in time. It was like 10 years since I had really been in therapy. And so it was a new opportunity to revisit these events and think about them, 10 years older than when I had thought about them before. And that was challenging sometimes, in part because of the level of immersion you need in order to write the book so that it resonates emotionally, and so it has enough specificity, to put the reader in the scene. But it also was an opportunity to sort of do a little bit more healing. And so there was a positive side to it, to really, from an even older perspective, to look back on my younger self as sort of a bit more sympathy, a bit more understanding, and a little bit less judgment.
That was my next question. Did your perspective on your life change while writing the book?
I mean, there were in particular a couple of events that I really sort of, the self-judgment or second guessing or beating myself up, it was still really in the background. They weren't fully resolved. And so when I wrote the book, In particular, I'm thinking of the one of the rapes that I had. There was something that happened that I was always second guessing if I made the right decision. And when I wrote the memoir, when I wrote those scenes, it actually became very clear to me that I made the only realistic decision that could have been made. And so it did help me sort of release that lingering self-doubt, that lingering second guessing. And so in that way, there were some positive results. Yeah.
Um, so a lot of your stories involve family and friends. Did writing this memoir affect your relationship with those family and friends?
So my primary abusers in the family were both, they had both died. One of them actually died after I had signed my contract, but the book hadn't yet come out. And so he died like 6 months before the book came out. But I mean, I was already going to publish it anyway. I had signed the deal, it just wasn't out yet. So that made it a little bit easier, especially because my mother, I did have some degree of relationship with her. And so that would have been, it would have been a challenge. She wouldn't have been happy. Now, don't get me wrong. I really took the advice I was given seriously, which is that, a memoir cannot be a revenge story. You actually do have to be fair to the people, even if they harmed you. It's got to be balanced. It's got to be honest. It's got to be fair. And so I really did portray them to the best of my ability in a balanced way. But still, she would not have been happy. There's nothing I could have said that would have made her happy. But they were gone. But the people that were close to them, like people that were close to my mother, some of them found it challenging to read the parts where she was abusive to me. But it wasn't that they didn't believe me or that they thought I did something wrong. It was just hard for them because they had a different relationship with her.
Okay. What themes or messages do you hope your readers will take away from reading your memoir?
Yeah, I mean, so I really wanted to, one of the reasons I wrote it was to show an example of recovery. Like I have 30 years of sobriety now, but it wasn't just that. It was that the reality is that substance use disorder, addiction, is often a result of trauma and or untreated mental health. And so I really wanted to show that connection was there for me too. That was what was propelling me into, really using drugs at an extreme rate. But at the same time that I recovered from all of it, right? And so that I didn't just get sober. I recovered from the domestic violence. I recovered from the child abuse, the sexual assault. It took a lot longer to recover from that than my drug use. But, I consider today, I say I'm 92 to 95% recovered, depending on the day. And so I wanted it to be an honest explanation about the interplay between those life challenges, but also the interplay with those recoveries. And just to be a reassurance that because so many people have similar histories, I wish I were unique in that way, but I'm unfortunately not. And I wanted it to be an honest example of not just substance sobriety, but getting becoming my authentic whole self through healing and a lot of work. And so that was a really major reason that I did it. But also that my sobriety recovery is a more individualized plan. It's not just the 12-step structured plan, AA or NA. And so I wanted an example of what a more individualized approach to recovery looks like, in part because more people are interested in that today. And so I didn't see a memoir out there talking about that. And I wanted to be an example of and a reassurance that approach can work and it can work well.
That was, I have to say, I've read a lot of recovery memoirs also, and I was really taken aback by your approach to like not wanting to be part of the 12 steps that is faith-based. You have to have the higher power, and it has, for the most part, it's God. But I wasn't aware, like in all the ones that I've read, I wasn't aware that there were others that, and yours is the first, and I was really like intrigued, like kind of amazed by, because I think that's, especially in today's world, I think that, less and less of the faith-based. So it was good to know that there's alternatives out there.
Yeah, and the other reality is it's not as if all faith-based people go to 12 steps and all the non-faith-based people go to, let's say, Life Ring, Secular Recovery, or She Recovers Foundation, or the others. There are atheists and agnostics that make 12 steps work, and there are a lot of faith-based people that are in programs like Life Ring and She Recovers because they prefer those other programs for reasons other than higher power. Like they may prefer the self-empowerment approach of Life Ring. They may like that She Recovers is for recovery, not just from substances, but also from trauma and mental health and behavioral disorders like eating or whatever. So people make choices for a variety of reasons. And so I think it's important. Yeah, not that I care where they go. I just want them to know there are choices out there so they can find the best fit. Because if they're in the right place, the place they're most comfortable, their odds of success will be higher.
So my thoughts after reading your memoir were that it was incredibly real and gut-wrenching. Have you received any feedback from readers that particularly impacted you?
I mean, people do write me about that they are sort of relieved, to see the depth and breadth of my recovery, that helps them feel more hopeful about their own recovery. And that's always rewarding to be able to be a reassurance. And it's not just the person with the addiction, the friends and family as well. Because, a substance use disorder has an impact on everyone who loves the person who's struggling, right? And so I just about 2 weeks ago, someone was talking to me about their nephew who was, had a meth use disorder. He's addicted to meth. And I said, well, how old is he? And she said, he's 32. And I said, well, I was 32 when I got sober, so it's sort of like, it's not too late. Don't lose hope. There's still a path forward. And so those things are really, those are the most rewarding, to be able to offer resources, like to be able to say, hey, family, there's this book called Beyond Addiction written for friends and family. It's really good. Or to be a reassurance for them. And I get those are the two most common messages I get. Either, can you offer some suggestions or guidance, or thank you so much for making me more hopeful that there is a possible way out of this misery.
And what legacy do you hope your memoir will leave behind?
I mean, I use the memoir really as part of my advocacy work, so it's all tied together. So I'm a retired judge now, and so that really opened it up for me to talk more, like, completely openly about my story in a way I couldn't when I was working. And so I'm on the board for Life Ring. I'm on the board for She Recovers. As you said, I've had opinion pieces in like the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times, and those, by the way, are on my website if anyone's interested, junkietojudge.com. Oh, and you can message me through my website too. And then I do, as you said, a lot of training. I do workshops. I've created a number of different workshops. I train lawyers and judges. And so for me, the book is tied to the advocacy work. And I will say that the judge title is really a tool at this point, right? I mean, it is an unusual story to have shot meth for that long and then become a judge. But now I use that title to sort of capture people's attention, not because I want them to pay attention to me, but I want to open their ears up a little wider so they can, better absorb the information I'm sharing. So I hope my legacy is some stigma reduction, right? Part of the reason I really wanted to own that I shot up, is to try to help reduce stigma about that. And that I use meth, which is really, portrayed as if people are, hopeless or, not deserving of our help when you see meth users on television or radio. But I want to reduce the stigma, provide hope, offer information about alternatives and other techniques that might be useful. And I try to use the book as part of that whole, all those efforts to me are all intertwined.
I'm going to unmute everyone. Like, I'm going to offer the option to unmute if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Mary Beth. This would be an opportunity. So if you wanted to chime in, I do have one final question for Mary Beth, but I do like to take this up. If you do not want to speak, you can also write your question in the chat and I will read it.
Mary Beth, this is Lisa
Hi,
from New
Lisa.
Jersey Humanist Network. I'm so happy to be here to support you. We have had you speak to our organization, and I just want to say really what an inspiration you are to the non-religious community. And I mean, everybody, I mean, yes, like you said, we have people in our own group who have used AA successfully, and they still, defend it. But that that clearly won't work for everyone. It's no program will work for everyone. But you've made more non-religious people aware of the options that there are options outside of AA. And I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you having had me speak. It was a very engaging, interactive discussion, which I always enjoy. But yeah, I mean the multiple pathways. I mean, I would say I've been sober for 30 years. When I got sober in '94, nobody was talking about that. I mean, it was really not sort of a topic on the table. But so I felt sort of alone when I was doing it, and also a little worried. Is it going to work, or is it okay that I'm making this choice to sort of guide my own recovery? I mean, there were alternatives to 12 steps even then that I used, but this idea of sort of taking ownership of your recovery plan wasn't really out there, and I don't even know if I would have phrased it that way. I was just talking about how I wanted to build a plan that would work for me, like, synthesize is the word I would use. So it is, people are much more interested in it today for multiple reasons, including because the science shows that people, not everyone's going to benefit from any one program, right? That what works for one person might not work for another. So it is rewarding to be able to be part of that conversation, especially as the interest in building that type of individual plan has gotten higher over the years.
Anybody else has any other questions? So I will ask my final question. What advice would you give to somebody considering writing their own memoir? It could be one based on trauma or addiction, or any kind of memoir.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to read memoir, of course, and really understand what it is. And there are a lot of decisions. Like, it's not an autobiography, right? It's not your entire life or everything that happened. It's really supposed to be around a certain theme or idea, or something that you learned or obstacle that you overcame. And so it's important to know that structure. But also, I went to writers' conferences, which can be really good places to get information. Like, for example, that's where I learned about this emphasis by publishers on platform, like how many Twitter followers do you have, or where have you spoken, or what group of people are going to be interested in your book. With a memoir, you have to actually write a book proposal. You have to write not just the book, but a book proposal if you're going to try to get an agent. But also, a lot of people self-publish. So part of it is, why am I writing it? Is it actually to get it published, or is it so that my family can read stories about my childhood or gain a better understanding? I mean, there's a lot of different motivators, and so it's good to think about those kind of things. But I also found it to be a real intellectual challenge, which I enjoyed. Learning how to write something well that you don't know how to do can be stimulating and interesting, even if it has its obstacles. And you also, in writers' conferences and writers' clubs and critique groups, you get to interact with other writers and share ideas and read each other's work. And so there's a community out there for you, and there's a lot of information out there that will help you think through, why am I writing this? What do I want the scope of the memoir to be? How do I do the good dialogue? What is takeaway and reflection? Let me learn about that. But there's a lot of resources, and there's a big community of memoir writers that you can be a part of.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth, for joining us this evening and for sharing your story. The library owns a copy of it, as Mary Beth told you. Her website, again, you want to share it, Mary Beth?
Yeah, so the book is available on Twitter and all the usual sites, and bookstores have it or can get it. And then my website is junkie2judge.com, and there's a lot of information, including my opinion pieces, and you can message me. As I always say, if you forget my name, all you have to remember is that Junkie Judge, and you can Google me and you can find me. I'm also on X, Twitter, if anyone's interested in recovery-related topics, and that's @MaryBethO_.
Thank you again. And wish you all the best of luck with your book and your retirement. Enjoy your retirement.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.